Hello everyone, welcome to the second meeting of our 44th season. We've had a lot of national figures come to World Affairs. We're very fortunate, very blessed. But tonight's even more special because we have with us someone, a person who has been on the international stage, the highest level. As you well know, you've read her biography over the last 6 months. And so Britain's leading stateswoman is with us, and it's a great delight to welcome Baroness Catherine Ashton. Thank you for coming tonight. Delighted also to welcome Sir Brian Fender of our advisory panel, who's been a great mentor to World Affairs over the years. And he's former Vice-Chancellor of Keele University, for those of you who don't have memories of those earlier days. So let me just explain what we're going to do tonight. So as you can see, we're in conversation rather than having a speaker at the podium. And I suppose in a sense we're going to be reliving history. And I think that's rather important for Keele World Affairs. We're all eager to learn about global issues and to cast our minds back, find out what mistakes humanity made in the past and try to learn from them. And we'll be drawing some conclusions about what's happened in the 21st century with our distinguished colleague. And of course, she's written a book which you are well aware of, and then a little more on that now, because what I'd like to say is that I don't like sort of political memoirs, and she has assured me that it isn't one of those at all, and she's absolutely right. It's got many virtues. One of us, it's not very long. It's only 250 pages, and I don't know what price it's out there at, but how many?
10 quid.
£10. Oh my goodness. Well, there you are. Now, if you read, I've read all the crits about Baroness Ashton's book, and basically, breathless is one of the words that comes across. I read it through and I thought, my God, this is exhausting. You find the life she actually led for 6 years, representing Europe in a number of different ways. There's a fly-on-the-wall quality about it as she meets all of these international leaders jostling and representing their countries, and she's trying to keep order. She'll tell you later on, I think, how her particular techniques for getting arguing prime ministers to settle down and talk sense. And I think what you'll find is that it's very personal, at times emotional, very objective, lucid, and it takes you into the heart of what it is to try to get things changed in the modern world, in a complex world. There's going to be a book signing, obviously, at the interval, and I hope that many of you will take the chance to meet Baroness Ashton there, and perhaps she'll give you a little dedication in the book. And then we're going to come back and have the traditional Q&A of our forum, and we'll be talking about that period in history. You can ask questions about that in the Q&A, but also, of course, you can ask, are you happy to take questions on
anything?
Anything? There you go. You have a free ride, and we'll try to balance out that conversation. A couple of questions for the audience, actually. Baroness Ashton represents continuity in that 6 years. I wonder how many, if you'd like to figure out how many world leaders were around continuously during that period, possibly to give some stability for good or for ill. And since she was in office, what about the United Kingdom? How many foreign secretaries has it had since she stepped down? And if you can work out the answer without looking at your mobile phones, you will get a prize. And then what? Dispatches from the Heart of 21st Century Diplomacy. So I've got two questions, Kathy. One is, why did you wait about 10 years to write the book? And why did you choose that title?
Bill, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for everybody for coming. Can I get rid of the Baroness bit?
Yes.
And I want to do it by just telling you a little story, which was that in 1999, when I was put into the House of Lords by the then Prime Minister, Tony Blair, remember him vaguely? My daughter, Rebecca, was 7, and she went to school the day after it was announced, and her head teacher said to her, "Now, Rebecca, something has happened to Mummy. Do you know what it is?" And Rebecca said, "Oh, yes, Mrs. Scruton. Mummy's become a baroness." And her teacher said, "Well, that's great, Rebecca, but do you know what it is, what it means?" And she said, "Oh, yes, she's halfway between a politician and a princess." Far too much the politician, not enough the princess, is what she would say. So my name is Kathy. That's what I like to be called. Please forget all the stuff. I didn't wait 10 years to write it because it's based on a series of conversations I had when I would come home from traveling, particularly dealing with issues like the Iran nuclear program or the Serbia-Kosovo deal, the Arab Spring, Ukraine, earthquakes in Haiti and in Japan. And my husband, who was, as he describes it, a recovering journalist, he's called Peter Kellner, some of you may have heard of him, and he would put a tape recorder and say, "So tell me." And I would just talk. And at the end of my time in office, he handed me a tape, because it was still a tape then, and said, "Over to you." And I put it in a drawer for a while. And then over time, I became curious to know what I'd said, and found, of course, that I'd forgotten so much of the detail. And what was great was that you can hear me get angry, you can hear me be sad, you can hear the kind of journey that I took on some of these issues. And eventually, I started to write it up. And the process of writing, as anyone has written, is long, it's difficult. Then you've got to find a publisher, then you've got to get the editor. So I probably finished it about 4 years ago. But that was still 6 years after I'd left. I think actually hindsight is interesting when you leave enough time. And what I promise you about the book is I've not changed anything. So I'm writing as if it was then. I haven't given you the kind of the version I would like to give you with the hindsight that I later had. So if you do buy it, I hope you enjoy it.
And then what? The name?
I used to say in the office, whenever I was given a briefing or somebody was coming to tell me about the latest issue and giving me a list of things we ought to do, my answer was always, "And then what?" Because too often in foreign policy, in development, in dealing with crises, we think about the immediate, the manifestation of the problem. What are we going to do about this? And rarely do problems end up being solved with the first go or in the first period of time. You know, issues take years to bubble up, centuries to become resolved. And so you always have to have in mind, what do we do next? So it became a kind of slogan that was associated with me that I felt represented how I feel we need to think about foreign policy, which is always, always ask the question, and then what? What happens next?
I think most of us here will have some recollections of getting jobs, being interviewed, looking for jobs, and so on and so forth. And sometimes it's an odd experience, sometimes it goes in a very systematic way. You got your job, you were in the House of Lords, of course, then something happened, all of a sudden that landed you in Brussels, and it looks as if it didn't go in the normal, conventional way. Would you like to tell us about that?
People have an illusion that government is organised. Well, maybe you don't, actually. But, stick with the idea for the moment. And I was leader of the House of Lords. It's October 2008. We're about to come back. Parliament's about to resume. And it's a Friday morning, and I am near my home. I've just gone out for something. And my phone starts ringing insistently. In the book, I say it's a BBC journalist. I can tell you in confidence it was Nick Robinson. And I thought, House of Lords, leader of the House of Lords, wet Friday afternoon. I mean, nobody rings. Why is he ringing me? So I went back home, opened the door, and my husband said, "Have you seen this?" And on the television, he had BBC News, but it was the same on Sky and everywhere else. And it said, Peter Mandelson is returning from Brussels, where he was Trade Commissioner, and he's going to be replaced today by Cathy Ashton. Okay. He said, well, has the Prime Minister, it was then Gordon Brown, have they rung you? Nope. And the ticker tape went on, and Adam Bolton appears at Downing Street saying, Cathy Ashton's expected to be going to Brussels this morning. Well, okay. And I sat there, and then my driver came, because I was going to go into the office, and the drivers, if you've ever seen Yes Minister, you will know, the drivers do know in advance, because they have to change the car or the location, so they know when they pick up a minister if they're going to be shuffled or changed. Leon, my wonderful driver, turned up, and I said, do you know? And he said, no. No. So we giggled a bit, and I went into my office, and the day wore on. And I'd arranged to meet my opposite number, the shadow leader, a wonderful man called Tom Strathclyde, the Conservative shadow leader who later became leader when the Conservatives won the election, or the coalition came in. And we were having lunch because we were working out legislation and how to manage it together. So I went to meet Tom, and he had a bottle of champagne waiting for me. And I said, well, that's lovely, Tom, but nobody's rung me. And he said, as anyone who's been in government would say, yeah, it's fantastic, isn't it? Government works so well. Eventually, I got a phone call with the words, will you get the next train? Which was a bit of a problem because my passport was somewhere else in a different city. But to cut a long story short, eventually I ended up on a Eurostar to Brussels with a bag packed by my husband, who delivered it to me. What I didn't realize when I set off that night was it would be 6 years before I would come home.
First job, trade. So what was in the intro? I mean, was this, we'll only talk a little bit about this, but was it all about bananas? I did notice it was a bit more complicated with the European Union and South Korea, some big deal. Were there highlights or lowlights in being Trade Commissioner?
The first thing you have to do is learn the language of trade, non-tariff barriers, phytosanitary, and so on. This is completely new to me. So it's like doing an A-level every day for a few weeks. And then you've got to work out what the priorities are, because trade, when you're working for one country, is complicated enough. You're trying to balance the benefits to your own nation and the opportunities for your own nation with the fact that whoever you're trying to do the deal with is doing exactly the same thing. Well, doing it for 27 countries, as before Croatia joined, is a bit more complicated, particularly with countries like South Korea. And also we were in discussion, though we hadn't opened the trade negotiations with Japan. I opened the Canada trade deal, which is now complete. And trying to work out what the most important issues were was really difficult. I suppose I would say there were two things. The first was trying to get things solved with the United States, was really important and really complicated. Bananas and beef. You'll probably have heard about hormone beef and all of that. Well, that was a big issue even then. And then with South Korea, it was the car industry. Excuse me a minute. This is a change of temperature.
Talk amongst yourselves.
Yeah, sorry. It'll come back in a sec. So it was the German car industry was very worried about Korean cars coming into Germany and taking the place of Volkswagen or other car industries across Europe, like Fiat. And that meant that we had to be really mindful of getting a deal that was going to manage that process. So I suppose in trade, the big question for me was not just the country we were going to do a deal with, but the countries of the EU and the impact on them.
Right, coming to it was a brief, glorious stint, and then suddenly another job. You can perhaps explain how it came about, but I'd like to read out your job title.
Yes.
I think you said it's the longest job title in history.
I think so.
High Representative of the Union for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy and Vice President of the European Commission.
Yes.
Wow. So how did that come about?
Well, the title came about because people didn't want to call it Foreign Policy Minister, especially the British. So they invented this long title to try and get the idea that it was representing all of the EU, but it didn't have Foreign Minister in the title. And it came about, I think, because we'd brought in the Lisbon Treaty, which was this new agreement that enabled Europe to bring together different positions into one. And they wanted to make sure that the British got one of the big jobs, that a woman got one of the big jobs, and that the politics of Europe, which was multifaceted, was represented. So I was woman, British, socialist, left of centre. And over the weeks before the job came about, it became obvious that this was going to be a possibility. And so it happened.
Can you just explain the role? Because what I've read is that you're there to represent the EU. You're also in political activity, but there's also a humanitarian dimension to it as well, isn't there?
Well, sort of. I mean, there was a humanitarian commissioner in the commission who dealt with the straightforward disaster issues. But because you were dealing with all the external action of the European Union, it meant that you were dealing with the politics or the consequences of that action. So the two best examples are the earthquakes in Haiti in 2010, and then, of course, the tsunami in Japan, where we had people on the ground very quickly. We had all of the usual instruments of development, you know, from tents and water to supplies to a process of rebuilding and so on. But you were also dealing with countries that had been traumatized in very different ways, and I've written about both of them and how different they were, but how the same thing happened. People went through this awful, terrible time. In Haiti, you had an earthquake that in 35 seconds killed 230,000 people. It destroyed all of the infrastructure. It killed everyone who was involved in the development of the country. In fact, one of the things that happened was a big meeting of all of the agencies, including the EU, in a building which was discussing what to do next to help the country as the earthquake happened, and everyone was killed. And then in Japan, what you had was a tsunami and an earthquake that months later, when I went to visit the epicenter of it, had completely destroyed communities and had kind of brought people together in a very different way. And the way that it was described to me was the nature of the way the houses faced each other. Traditionally in Japan, you would build your front door so it looked away. But people had become so traumatized, so changed, that they asked to have their front doors facing each other. And my job was to help think about the longer term. How were we going to not just rebuild what was, but tackle some of the problems that lay underneath, especially in Haiti? Japan was much more able to deal with this. But they did have consequences. Fukushima and the nuclear story of Japan had a direct impact on Germany's decision not to pursue nuclear power. There were consequences in terms of understanding the impact of earthquake, of tsunami, of additional to that in a way, climate change, and how we would manage major disasters in the future. So there was a sort of development angle that was about the longer term rather than the immediate.
One of the things I realize in the book, you read chapter by chapter all these different huge scenarios that you're working on, and you think, you get the feeling these are coming one after the other. But actually quite a lot of them were going on in parallel.
Yeah.
And we'll get to talk, the ones we'll talk about last were already in the in tray right at the beginning, weren't they? But if we could sort of move on to sort of May 2011, I seem to remember that you flew to Benghazi. And could you sort of tell us a little bit? I mean, that was probably pretty a dangerous thing to do, and there were lots of different international views as to what should happen. Would you like to sort of explore the complexity of that with us and how you were able to perform your role in that context?
Well, Benghazi was part of the thing we call the Arab Spring, if you remember, that began in Tunisia when a man called Mohamed Bouazizi, a young man, set fire to himself because he couldn't get a permit to sell fruit and vegetables, which he needed to feed his family. And it sort of started something that spread across Egypt, occasionally countries that were less affected, like Jordan, countries of the Arab world, and into Libya. And it became a huge problem for Gaddafi, who railed against his people, who accused them of trying to destroy his country because they protested about his regime. And he threatened to kill the people in Benghazi, which was the sort of center of opposition to him. And a coalition led by France and Britain was put together to protect the people of Benghazi by using eventually NATO bombing of Gaddafi's troops to prevent him going in. And I went the day that the NATO bombing stopped. And the danger I was in was not from that. Probably the greatest danger was that Gaddafi had made sure that nobody except the military had any gun of any kind. And during this sort of revolutionary period, guns appeared out of nowhere. So the biggest danger you had was people letting off gunfire because they were so happy. So you had this sort of gunfire raining everywhere, which was actually a real problem. And that's why I was in Benghazi, was to meet with the people we hoped would become the next government of Libya if Gaddafi left.
Did you feel that there was conflict with some of the leaders, like I think it was Sarkozy, was keen to spearhead the more aggressive side of this?
Yeah, I mean, there was a dilemma at the heart of it, because for some governments, especially in Europe, this had a ring to it of Iraq. You know, there were many countries who had been unsure of the action in Iraq long before it took place, and many more who were very unsure about Iraq after it had taken place. And so there was a sort of concern that this was an adventure, a European version, if you like, adventure that would potentially lead to a similar set of problems of a country that was thrown into chaos. And so the way it manifested itself, and again I've written about this, was through this idea of a no-fly zone. And you've all heard of no-fly zone. But what interested me was, what did that mean? And it became very clear very quickly that there were lots of different versions of what it meant. For some people, it just meant you declared a no-fly zone, and it was a sort of benign concept. For the military, they would say it's a declaration of not war, but of aggression, because in order to have a no-fly zone, you must enforce it, which means you must be prepared to shoot down things that fly. And there were lots of things in the middle. In the middle, people said, well, it might mean blowing up the communications or the airfields to stop things flying, but it doesn't mean blowing them out of the sky. One of the many conversations we had to have all the time was, what version of this are we talking about? What is it we're actually trying to do? And on top of that, to try and work out what we needed to do to make sure that people felt comfortable with any action. So, for example, did the countries of the region, we use the Arab League, which is the 50-plus countries who call themselves part of the Arab world. Do they want us to do this? Does the UN Security Council think it's a good idea? You know, all the criteria that you can imagine. And only when all that criteria was fulfilled, and it was, did any action take place. But it became controversial in its own way, because, as many of you will know, Libya is hardly a settled, calm country. It's still in a degree of chaos.
We haven't mentioned the United States very much, but over a meal we were talking about that supposed remark by Henry Kissinger that if only he had one phone number that he could ring so he could find out what Europe thinks. Apparently he never said it, I understand, but if he had said it, you'd have been the person he'd have rung. Yeah,
well, we don't, I mean, he says he said to me that he didn't say it, but the idea was always there that, you know, when you think about Europe and getting Europe to do anything, where do you start? And that these new positions created the opportunity to just have one person. One of my first meetings when I became High Representative was in the Kremlin with the Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Lavrov, who was extremely skeptical, shall we say, about this new job that I had taken on. And I decided that I would tell him a joke, which was something that someone had said to me, and it's the answer to the Henry Kissinger question. And it goes like this, which is, Hillary Clinton goes to see President Obama and says, "Good news, Mr. President, finally we have one phone number for Europe. And it belongs to this woman called Kathy, And if we ring her, we can get the answer to what Europe is thinking and what Europe wants to do. And the president says, that's great. Why don't we call her now? So Hillary picks up the phone and she dials my number. And she gets my voicemail. And I say, welcome to Europe. For the French position, press 1. For the German position, press 2. And that was really although it was a joke, it made Lavrov laugh. It was also a way of describing, I think, the very beginning of trying to create this new foreign policy, which was that you did have all of these different positions. And the sort of trick was to blend it into one position, into a European approach or a European set of views. We used to call them council conclusions. And it just meant that we wrote it down, that gave me my mandate to act, and to which everybody was going to be bound. So if we said we were going to do this in Libya or this with Ukraine, everybody took the same view.
Talking again about the USA, though, although it's not as complicated as Europe, they're a pretty powerful lot. How difficult did you find it to deal with the Americans in all the things you were trying to achieve, given their power and their perceived role?
We spent a lot of time talking to the US. I mean, beyond the EU, we would spend most of our time on the phone, on email, dealing with the US, either because they were sort of racing off over here on an issue, which was probably the direction Europeans wanted to go, but we needed to make sure, or because for them, Europe was a much more important partner than perhaps it looks from the outside. An example of that is, if you're going to do sanctions against Russia, sanctions from Europe will have a much bigger effect on Russia than sanctions from the US. And that's just about geography and connections. If we don't buy goods, energy from Russia, it matters to the economy. If the Americans don't, it has very little effect. It's also that this kind of coming together of values and ideas and so on matters. If you're trying to put pressure on a country, as we did with Iran for the Iran negotiations, the combination, the weight, the difference, the variation, all of that plays its part. So the US were a very key ally to me. And I dealt with President Obama, with Secretary Clinton, with Secretary John Kerry. So I was fortunate that these were people it was very easy to relate to.
Can we move back to Europe and talk about something that you were quite famous for, which was the Serbia-Kosovo negotiations? I mean, the history of Yugoslavia is so complicated. It was the most recent activity. 2008, Kosovo declares independence. 5 years later, you are deeply engaged in trying to get some agreement between them and the people, Kosovans, who don't want to be part of them. And all these people I read in the book, they've all got difficult names. I don't know, were you good on these names? Dacic, Nikolic, Vucic, Vucevic, and so it goes on. There's a picture of you, which is going to come up on the screen, where you earlier. That's where you're. I think that's the one where you're in Belgrade, talking to the Serbians, isn't it?
That's Nikolic and Dacic, yes.
Yeah.
I'm in Belgrade, yeah.
So President and Prime Minister of Serbia. Would you like to? It's a convoluted story which we can't go into in full detail. But would you like to sort of explain how you handled it? You told me a little story over the meal, which I thought might help everyone here understand how difficult it was for you.
Well, I'm grinning, so this is obviously as I'm about to get some kind of agreement. So Serbia-Kosovo, essentially the view that the Serbs have been enemies of the Kosovar Albanian population forever, have oppressed them, which they have committed or tried to commit genocide against them, which they did. And you will remember, many of you, the streams of refugees in Kosovo as people were being forced from their homes by Milosevic and the Serbs who were coming to attack them. And it was something that Tony Blair and Bill Clinton engaged with to get NATO to bomb Serbia to stop the war. But Serbia has never recognized Kosovo as an independent country, even though Kosovo has declared independence, as you rightly say, Bill. And the manifestation of the problem is in the north of Kosovo, a small area, 60,000 people, mainly full of Serbs, Kosovar Serbs, who live there, who look to Serbia and who do not see themselves as part of Kosovo, with some Kosovar Albanians who say, we are one country, you should look to Pristina, our capital, not to Belgrade, the capital of Serbia. And it becomes, over the period of time from when they declared independence, like the Wild West. It's just crazy. There are guns everywhere, people are killed. We have customs gates that go between Serbia and Kosovo that are always on fire. The EU is there trying to manage the customs and other parts of the relationship, and we can only get our staff there by helicopter because it's too dangerous. And there are NATO forces keeping the peace. It is a mess. And the Serbia-Kosovo agreement is the first agreement to try and normalize relations between them sufficiently so that the people who live in the north don't have to live in the Wild West. And it was things like, one judicial system, one police force, trying to stop Serbia from interfering and also recognizing that this was a particular population of people who needed an extra special relationship with Kosovo rather than an extra special relationship with Belgrade. And I brought the two prime ministers together. That's one of them.
Yeah,
on the left.
The next photograph is going to come up. We'll show you both of them, I think.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, there you go.
Right, so those are the two prime ministers. On my right is Ivica Dačić, who's then the Prime Minister of Serbia. And on my left is Hasim Tači, who's then Prime Minister of Kosovo. Today, Ivica is Foreign Minister of Serbia. Hasim Tači is in The Hague being prosecuted for war crimes. So these are not people that you classify as cuddly. When they first walked into the room to begin the conversation with me about whether we could find a way through, they are men of the same age. They live a few miles apart. They were sweating. They were terrified because what they were doing was meeting with the devil. They were going to sit in a room with somebody that they, by definition, had nothing but hatred for. And they did it. And bravery in politics is not something you see very often, but that was real bravery. By this point, they know each other pretty well. I've had them meeting each other, dining together with me, and so on. But it was an extraordinary thing to do. And the level of kind of hatred and history to it was brought home to me when I'd suggested a meeting on June the 28th. And they both went, oh, you can't do that. That is the Battle of Kosovo, at which point one of them starts singing one song, one of them singing another song. I don't know what they're talking about. So I say, in my best naive Lancastrian way, and when was the Battle of Kosovo? And they say 1389.
But you got there.
But we got there. We got the first agreement. Now, anyone watching the news will know that things are not going well between the new prime ministers, the new president and the prime minister, Vucic, who's the president of Serbia, and Albin Kurti, who's the new prime minister of Kosovo, who are the two real interlocutors. But I think the biggest lesson of all of that is simply that if you're going to do anything, get any level of dialogue, you have to start somewhere, and you have to start small. And that's what we did.
And that was one of the achievements that led you, I believe, to be nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize.
It was the year Malala won, and quite rightly Malala won.
Can I read a little bit out? We're going to move on now to Iran and the search for a nuclear agreement. This work started. It was there right at the beginning. Although we're going to talk about 2013. Can I just read from your chapter 7 of your book? A few days after I took office in the autumn of 2009, as I was still getting to grips with the scale of the job, a colleague mentioned that I was now responsible for chairing and leading the international negotiations on Iran's nuclear program. I looked at him in disbelief as he explained that in my new role, I was mandated by the UN Security Council to convene and manage the meetings. Wow.
Wow. Yeah.
So this went on for quite a long time. There were many, many meetings. And then it all sort of came to a head in 2013. Could you just quickly give us some sense? Because there were lots of parties in this. It's the P5
right.
plus one. Really complicated.
It's really easy.
Go, good.
So if you go back, people have been worried about Iran's nuclear program since the beginning of the 2000s. So in about 2002, three European countries, France, Britain, Germany, decided to start talking to Iran about its program. And a few years later, the other members of the Security Council, that's the Chinese, the Russians, and the Americans, who joined the French and British, joined in. So it was the permanent 5 members plus one, i.e. Germany, because they'd been part of the original conversation. So in Europe, we called it the E3 plus 3, and the Americans always called it the P5 plus 1. It's 6. And in the course of all that, the EU became designated by the Security Council, and me by name, as the person who would convene, chair, and lead the negotiations. And I did that actually after I left office. I carried on doing it. So I did the negotiations from 2009 until about 5 or 6 weeks before the deal was done, when I handed over to my successor, because at that point she'd been in office a while. She needed to take responsibility. So the deal for me was 4.5 years, and I spent more time with the Iranians, as I used to joke, than I did with my family.
And it wasn't straightforward. It wasn't just a case of rooms in which there's a 6 and the Iranians are sitting around the table. There is also stuff going on somewhere else, isn't there? There are other negotiations. Would you like to tell us? Because that must have really queered your pitch. Would you like to tell us about that?
So of the 6 countries, 5 of them were able to talk to Iran bilaterally as well as in the group. And we built a good team with the Chinese, Russians, French, British, Germans, Americans, all working together. It was, in my view, an incredibly great example of, well, the only example in history of the 5 permanent members working on something and sticking with it. Even though, by the way, the Ukraine crisis began in the middle of all this. So I would be in Vienna negotiating with the Iranians, with the Russians as my ally, flying from Vienna to Kiev, where the Russians were being heavily criticized by me for what they were doing in Ukraine. They would fly back to Moscow and attack the EU, and then we would fly back to Vienna and carry on the talks. Compartmentalization of a very particular kind. But the one country that couldn't talk to Iran bilaterally was the United States, because ever since the hostage-taking in 1979, this had been a no-no. And it was impossible for the Iranian team to be seen to be talking to the Americans on their own. So quietly, and to my great delight when I discovered it, the Americans were talking to the Iranians in Oman. And they'd had several meetings. I didn't know what they were doing because I'd actually asked not to know, so that when it came out, I would not be accused of having kept it from the others. But I was delighted that they were doing it. But it's always the way when you do something that is hidden and you bring it out into the open, it doesn't always go down well with everybody. And you've often moved the conversation on in a way that not everybody likes. So we came to the day when the Americans needed to bring everybody into the story, into understanding what they had been doing. And as importantly, they had started to do an outline of what an agreement might look like. And it was, there shall be ... kilograms of ... It had a sort of beginning that talked about what we would do in the end, and it had a bit that said what Iran would do and a bit what we would do, and then a sort of conclusion. So it wasn't a long document, but it was a document, and nobody knew about this document except, of course, the Americans and the Iranians. And the Americans wanted me, and the Iranians wanted me, because I was leading the negotiations, to get everybody else signed up to this document, that this would be the basis on which we would fill in the dots, and I would lead the negotiations to a conclusion. So around midnight in Geneva, as it happened, the Americans came to me and said, here is the document. It's been through the US process. Can you please go and persuade all the others that we can use this document? And they said, the only problem is, Kathy, nobody can change anything. Not a comma, not a word, because it's taken so long to get these words agreed. They can't change it. So I go, first of all, to see the Russians. The Deputy Foreign Minister of Russia, Sergei Ryabkov, is looking rather white-faced with anger that this has all been happening. And I say to him, look, the process may be awful from your point of view, but the product's quite good, because it was. The only thing is, Sergei, when you send it to Moscow, they can't change it. What? They can't change it. I can't exactly remember the words he said, but you can probably imagine. I then go from him to the Chinese, who are not impressed at all, but agree to send it to Beijing. I go to the French, who are screaming. and say, there's no chance we won't change it, of course. The Germans who are looking very stoic, and the British who pretend they knew anyway. And I get back to my room. It's by now about, I don't know, middle of the night, 3, 4 in the morning. And I sit down feeling completely drained, at which point the door opens and the American team come back and they say, Kathy, we're really sorry. We gave you the wrong version.
But
It's true.
triumph in the end. We've got a photograph coming up of Kathy with her hand on the microphone, leading these distinguished...
Do you recognize them? You recognize William Hague, I think. That's Guido Westerwelle, who was the German foreign minister, who sadly died very young, not long after this. And then that's Javad Zarif, who is the Iranian foreign minister at the time, now an advisor to the president. Wang Yi, who was the Chinese foreign minister. John Kerry. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister. And Laurent Fabius, the French foreign minister. This is 5 o'clock in the morning. Nobody slept for I don't know how long. And we're in Geneva. This is the interim agreement where we announced that we'd achieved that.
Great success, and there's more about that complicated stuff in the book. And let's just move on to Ukraine. And this, as you said, this is happening in parallel. And I think that, November 2013, there's this idea that Ukraine's going to sign an association agreement with the EU. That's, my goodness, so think about that now. And then by December, you're in Kiev, and you're walking around the Maidan. Would you like to say a little bit?
That photograph you just saw is at the end of a long and difficult few days in Geneva. And I flew from there to Vilnius in Lithuania for the signing of the agreement with Ukraine. And this was an agreement that had been negotiated for 7 years. It was about trade and institutions and collaboration, and it had been initialed, just waiting for the signature. And I walked into the lobby of the hotel, and the president of Ukraine, Yanukovych, saw me, walked across a lobby full of people, and said, I can't sign it. And my heart sank, because this was the centerpiece of a meeting of all the heads of state of the EU, and of a series of countries like Georgia, Moldova, and of course Ukraine. The rest, in a way, is history. He wouldn't sign. He went back. The demonstrations began. I end up in Maidan.
And by August, I think there's another meeting. Aren't you in Minsk? With Poroshenko of course, it's Poroshenko as Prime Minister. Then Lukashenko, we know all about him, the host, and you'll meet Putin.
Well, I'd met Putin many times by then.
Yes. Okay.
For lots of different reasons. We had summits with Moscow every 6 months, so we saw a lot of Russia. And as I said, Russia was an ally on the Iran talks, so not all meetings were negative, as it were. But in the August of 2014, Crimea's been taken, the Donbass is under siege. Lukashenko hosts a meeting in Minsk in Belarus, which is Poroshenko, who's the new president of Ukraine, Putin of Russia, Nazarbayev, who was president of Kazakhstan, and myself representing the EU. And I had 2 commissioners with me, one for trade, one for energy, because those were the economic issues that Ukraine was most worried about, obviously, with Russia. And it was a meeting where we also were engineering for Poroshenko of Ukraine to spend some time with Putin.
And it all ended in tears.
Well, it didn't end well, but it was a different kind of ending to the situation that we found 10 years later or 8 years later. You know, at that point, you had a country where Putin had done what he liked to do, which is put a wedge into the country, same as in Georgia, so that the country is not quite whole. It can't quite operate as a sort of country where the capital is seen to represent everybody. And that means that it's unlikely that it's going to be able to join organizations like the EU or NATO or anyone else. And it's unlikely that it's going to be able to develop and grow because you don't get inward investment. And that was what we assumed Putin would continue to do, because it's also, from his point of view, relatively cheap. You haven't got big armies. You don't need huge numbers of people. You just need, in the case of Georgia, barbed wire and enough people willing to be on your side when it comes to causing trouble. Of course, he didn't stay there. But that was the situation that we thought we were in for a number of years afterwards.
Could you just sort of sum up, as time is pressing, is it possible for you to describe the best day in this in your life during this role, and the worst?
Gosh. So I suppose the best days are always the days when you succeed. So probably the Iran deal and the Serbia-Kosovo deal were good days, because against all the odds. And, you know, anyone who's done negotiation will know, you don't know it's going to work. You know, the Serbia-Kosovo deal, on the Wednesday, the Kosovar delegation had left. They'd left my office at midnight. They were going home. There was no deal. And it was only when they set off to get home, they got halfway home, and then they stopped. And when I'd heard that they'd stopped, I thought there was a chance that we could get them to turn round. But it took 36 hours to turn them round and to get the Serbs back. So until they actually signed, we had no idea whether they would. And I think with the Iran deal, you know, that last night we went back and forward for hours and days before it. And I remember we got to 5 a.m. and we had the deal. This is the first deal, the interim deal. And I thought, if we don't announce this now, something will go wrong. Somebody in Tehran will say no, or one of the 6 countries will find something else, you know? Which is why it was announced in the middle of the night, because we wanted to get it in the open, because once it was in the open, it was done. So you're always in a situation where you're not quite sure. So it's both a wonderful day and terrifying, because until you've announced it, and even when you saw me with the microphone, I'm just wondering if the Iranians will say, oh, hang on a minute, we've just thought of something. Or somebody's going to say, well, what about this? Or whatever. So these are great days, but also, as I say, really scary days too. And the worst days are when it all falls apart. So worst days are when you see tragedy everywhere you look, when you lose people, because we did lose, not many, but a few people in some of the terrible incidents that happen, and where you have the moment of humility when you meet people in difficult places who are just trying to live or to get by, or people who have lost everything in tragedy. And if you look around the world now, you look at what's happening in the Middle East, you look at Ukraine, you look at the terrible crisis erupting in Sudan that we're barely aware of, and lots of other places. You know, those are terrible days when you think what's happening to people everywhere.
I'm going to give the last word as we close this part of the meeting to Peter O'Bourne, who has been at our podium before the pandemic. Some of you may remember him. He was a very forceful character, critical of governments.
I'm me.
And you. But, he said, let's admit we were all completely wrong. It's now obvious that Catherine Ashton has been a success. In her unobtrusive but determined way, she can boast real achievement. Last year, a peace deal was struck between Serbia and Kosovo. No one had thought it possible. I've never met Baroness Ashton, but I guess that one of her secrets is that she keeps her head down, does not flaunt her ego, and allows others to take the credit. Let's take a break. Right, I'll start off with Zena and Alex, the question. What was your first step in diplomacy? And Linda asks, where did you start your amazing career? And she's added to it, what do you do to relax?
So, Zena and Alex, congratulations on being students who are going to change the world, and I apologize for the mess we've made of it. First step in diplomacy. Well, I said to somebody in the book signing, everybody is a bit of a diplomat, and they looked at me very skeptically. I suppose I would say, first of all, I've brought up 5 children. That's the first step in diplomacy. In a way, I'm not somebody who's got a real expertise in anything. You know, I'm not a doctor or a lawyer or an accountant or somebody who can teach particularly well. But I have a skill set which is about things I'm reasonably good at. And the first thing about diplomacy, the most important skill of all, is the ability to listen. And it's to listen to what's being said between the words. When you are confronted, especially in more formal diplomatic situations, people will be either reading out their brief or they'll be setting out their opening position. And so the most important thing is to listen to what they're really saying to you, because often in a nuance or in an emphasis or just in the way they are, you get an understanding. And perhaps the best illustration that you all do it is you must all have at some point in your lives gone into a room where you've seen a couple of maybe friends or a couple that you know, and you can cut the atmosphere with a knife. You know that something's happened, but they haven't said anything. They haven't done anything. You can just feel it. And I think the biggest skill in diplomacy is that ability to listen and also to sense and feel what's really going on. What do I do to relax? Play with my grandchildren, cook, go to see a film, all the things that you do, because I'm just me and a girl from Wigan, you know? We just do the same stuff. What was the other one?
Yes, yeah, we now got some questions about egos. Right, and so what's your strategy for wearing down the egos to achieve your successful outcomes? That's from Linda and Viv. And Julie says, how do you negotiate with challenging personalities when the lives of civilians are at stake? And Catherine Escott, how do you broker the deals? And do you use any influencing techniques, motivation factors? She also mentions bribes, but I don't think you get... well, what's the skill set? Can you let us into some secrets?
I think that, you know, in any negotiation, it's about understanding, first of all, where the people you're negotiating with are coming from, what they're looking at. You know, you look at the world through the lens that is you, and if you're negotiating, you're taking a particular position. You have a view of the problem, the crisis, the situation. But almost by definition, it's not the same view as the people you're negotiating with. I do this with students. I give them pictures, and it'll be me and Maidan, or me talking to Putin, or me talking to Obama, or me talking with someone else, or me with a group of young people. And I'll say, what do you see? And they will describe it. And I'll say, right, now I want you to tell me from the position of if you were advising President Putin, what do you see? And when you see me standing in Maidan, if you're from a Russian perspective, it's not a benign picture at all. It's something quite different. So you have to begin in dealing with any egos in understanding what they are looking at. You don't have to agree with it. You don't have to move an inch towards them, but you need to know what it is. And then I think it's about understanding a little bit more about who these people are and what their ego is all about. You know, egos are kind of often the display of egos is often a way of hiding something, or it's often a way of just trying not to engage with you. And you've just got to work around it. And again, these are not skills that you train for in a way. They're skills that we've all got. You just have to use them in a different setting. It's a bit more high risk. It's a bit more high stakes. But people, as they do in every walk of life, suffer from the delusion that somehow they are more important than anyone else and that they are the people who really count, or that they simply don't care what happens to anyone. They will pursue the thing they want to pursue regardless. And you just have to work around and manage it, or try and make them see that they can get what they want, but by a different route. A much harder thing to deal with, because egos, in a sense, you recognize, and they're easy. Whether you succeed or not is another thing, but it's easy to know what you're dealing with. But much, much harder is dealing with people who genuinely want to do the right thing, but believe that by doing the right thing, all that will happen is they will lose power, that they will not be in control. And that is a really genuine, realistic problem. So when you saw the pictures of the Serbia and Kosovo, and I said Hasim Taci, who was the Prime Minister of Kosovo, is now in The Hague on war crimes. He was the head of the Kosovo Liberation Army. He is being charged with being in command of the army when it massacred people. The Hague will work out what the truth or not of all of that is. But when he was Prime Minister, he feared that by doing things that would benefit Serbia, in other words, by negotiating and mediating and being prepared to make compromises, he would lose support in his own country by people who said, why are you doing this? Why are you giving away things? Why are you being nice to these people? And that is exactly what happened. So egos are difficult, but almost harder than that is trying to persuade people to move from just being leaders to being prepared to be statesmen.
We got a couple of questions about language, which I think is quite relevant. So Anil Vagmaria asks, how many languages do you speak? Tony Ferniho says, in which language were negotiations conducted, and did you have any problems with translators and so on? I mean, I can see how tricky that is.
I speak two languages, Wigan and English. Internationally, English is the language that is used. So a little tiny story about language in the Iran talks. Remember, the Iran talks is China, Russia, France, Germany, UK, US. Everything we did in agreeing the words and the dots and the commas had to work in Russian, in Mandarin, in English, in French, in German, and in Farsi for the Iranians. Not easy. The only time we had a problem was between the Americans and the British. And it was that the Americans wanted to begin a sentence in the agreement with the words, set forth. Now, set forth to them meant write down. To me, it means put your hat and coat on and go for a walk. And I wish you could have seen the faces of the Chinese, Russians, Germans, etc., as me, and it was actually the people in the White House, are arguing about these two words, and they're going, you know, how come there isn't a problem with us? It was settled because eventually the person who was pushing for set forth got on a plane to Afghanistan and they were out of communication for 11 hours. So I just changed it.
Back channels. Keith Warburton would like to know your experience. How important are back channels in diplomacy? We had one example in our chat.
We did, and in the talks in Oman. Back channels really matter, and my hope is, when you look at the world we are in now, that there's a lot of back channels going on, because we're in more trouble than I think we are if they're not. The difficulty in any negotiation or any crisis, and it's been magnified by 24-hour media, social media, the constant contact, the constant need to feed the beast, if you like, of news, is that it's harder and harder to do things quietly and to do them at the speed you need to do them. Diplomacy is a drip, drip, drip job. It doesn't often move quickly, or at least to proper resolution, it doesn't. You may stop things getting worse quite quickly, but you don't solve them quickly. And so it's very important to do things behind the scenes. In the Iran talks, the one thing you will never find is me doing an interview. You'll see me do every press conference, if you look it up, I'm not suggesting you do, with the Iranian foreign minister, me and him. But I never give an interview. And the reason is because there had to be somebody who everyone knew did not talk about what was going on, and who kept absolutely quiet the detail of what was really being negotiated. So back channels matter. They matter because they are hidden, and it allows people to meet and talk properly without a press conference, without necessarily being challenged by their own people or by being challenged by anyone else. But they're incredibly difficult to bring into the light and to move from the shadows, because inevitably you're trying to get people to jump from where they were in a conversation or where they think things are happening to what's really going on. The greatest diplomat I have ever known is a man called Bill Burns. He currently runs the CIA, but you will have seen, if you've watched the news, but now I've said his name to you, that he's often flying around the Middle East, etc. If you want to know where the real negotiations are going on, I kind of would follow where Bill was going.
We got a question upstairs. Microphone? Yes, to the left of the clock.
Good evening. Every day we hear about people coming across the channel in boats, the so-called illegal immigrants. All this started with the Schengen Agreement. So why don't people just pull out of the agreement?
Well, it didn't start with the Schengen Agreement. You asked me earlier whether Schengen was a place. Schengen is a small town in Luxembourg, but from it you can see 3 countries. So it became the name of a place that identified what was going to be the ability of people to get in a car in France and drive all the way to Germany and beyond if they wanted to. It covers a number of countries. And any of you who've done a motoring holiday in Europe, particularly when we were in the EU, will have experienced Schengen. It just means that the outer borders of the EU are secure. The inner borders, you can move around. Doesn't mean you can get into the EU any easier. It just means once you're in, you can move about. The problem with small boats is a difficult and challenging one. At the moment, the majority of people sitting in Calais trying to get to Britain are probably from Sudan, because in Sudan we're about to face the worst famine that anyone has ever remembered, where we have 8.8 million displaced people internally in Sudan and 2 million displaced outside, and a country that's completely collapsing with no food, no medicines, and with a sort of civil war that's diversifying and being fed from the outside. It is horrific. So people will flee. And some of them will want to come here, either because they speak the language, because they have relatives, because they think this is a safe place to be. The challenge of all of us on small boats or any form of illegal migration is to stop it needing to happen in the first place. Because people generally don't want to leave home, they want to stay home. They leave because they don't think there's anything else they can do. And that's what we have to work on. And that means thinking long term, and it means working together, and it means finding answers. It means stopping the gangs. It means doing lots of different things at the same time. But it's not really about Schengen.
We'll take a question, the microphone, front row.
Kathy, to what degree should those of us actively supporting Ukraine and her people fear a Trump victory in the forthcoming presidential election? And what can be done to mitigate that danger?
I think everyone is kind of beginning to focus more and more on the outcome of the American election, and I don't know which way it's going to go any more than anyone else. There is a real concern that President Trump will want to show that he is the great president who can solve wars. And the obvious war that he will look to try and solve will be Ukraine and Russia, for all sorts of reasons. And depending on whether you like him or you don't like him or whether you're indifferent to him, it's a lot to do with how far he thinks he can really influence the war in both directions. One being support for Ukraine, which he can certainly influence by switching it off, and the other is by any kind of relationship he may or may not have with President Putin. And I'm not somebody who believes the fantastic stories, but I am somebody who thinks that there's been a lot of contact between them in the course of his presidency that suggests to him that he can have greater influence. I think the reality in the American system is that it's not just down to the president, it's also down to Congress. And Congress has been prepared to continue to fund Ukraine and to continue to be relatively strong in support. But it will be different if President Putin decides, or President Trump decides with President Putin and President Zelensky to try and make a change. And that will have a huge impact on Europe, because at the end of all this and the end of the war, one of two things will have happened. Either Europe will be different or Russia will be different. And the question for all of us is, which one is it going to be?
Well, questions about Brexit. View and Upcott Gill.
I didn't like it.
No, we thought that before you came. How much do you think Brexit has contributed to the destabilization of the world? Is Vivian Upcott's Gill's take on it? Tony MacDonald thinks it's a total disaster and wonders what you think. Linda Sherwood, where has Brexit left the UK in terms of world influence?
I was very sad about Brexit from a foreign policy, security, defence perspective, because one of the things about being part of a group is that your issues become their issues. So you're able to amplify your concerns through the other countries who are part of the group. And I saw that for real. I chaired Foreign Affairs Council meetings for 5 years. We met 50 times, formally 12 times, informally. We never voted, we never failed to reach agreement. I'd like to tell you it's because I'm a brilliant chair of a meeting, but actually it's because that's what people wanted to do, was find agreement. And Britain played a big part in that. William Hague was a foreign minister, David Miliband had been a foreign minister, Philip Hammond. Those were the 3 foreign ministers I dealt with the most, and each of them played their part in supporting their colleagues' issues and in pushing and promoting issues of interest and concern to Britain. And we have moved away from that. There is a very strong desire in the world to see Britain engaged in it, not just with Europe, not just with the US, but as Britain. And I think with all of the post-Brexit internal kind of machinations, people sort of felt we moved inwards rather than outwards. And there's an expectation and a hope that we'll now start to think and behave more externally. The exception to what I just said is the support for Ukraine, which the Conservative government and Boris Johnson in particular was absolutely determined on and has been continued. So it's not all doom and gloom from that point of view. But I think there's a real hope that we'll get more engaged and more collaborative again in the future.
John Moultram is asking about right-wing governments in Hungary and Slovakia. How concerned should we be about that, and how concerned is Ursula von der Leyen?
How concerned?
Is Ursula von der Leyen?
We've had a right-wing government. We've had Viktor Orban in Hungary for quite a long time. I remember him well as Prime Minister. And Robert Fico in Slovakia, this is his third go at being Prime Minister. So these are not unknown quantities. But there's a new government trying to be put together in Austria. We've had the elections in the Netherlands. We've got the Czech elections next year. You have, in a number of countries, a concern that what let's call them right-wing governments, populist governments, are becoming more to the fore in terms of politics. I think it's because in part, we don't really have a story to tell from what I would call the mainstream political parties, from the sort of centre-right through to the centre-left. We don't really have a description of the kind of world we want to have and how we're going to get there. We have a lot of doom and gloom about things that have gone wrong, and we have a lot of issues that people worry about. They worry about getting a doctor's appointment. That's not just here, that's lots of places. They worry about migration, whether it's a real worry or something that just they feel unsure about. They worry about the state of the world. They worry about whether our leaders are strong enough. There's a sort of sense that, well, maybe if we had a few more strong men in charge, that could make a difference. It doesn't. They worry about there not being some punchy, clear story that says, this is what I will do for you. And you see the politicians who are popular are those who are really good at kind of communicating what they think. Whether you agree with them or not, they're really good at it. And so, yes, we should be worried. Yes, Ursula will be worried about the impact in the European Parliament, in the domestic situations, and in the European Council. But it's worth remembering that when European politicians come to Brussels, they don't take off their domestic worries like a rucksack and become European. They're still domestic. And it's always been the same. Next question.
Next question is from Tony Howell, and it's about gender, if you'll forgive me. So to what extent does being a woman help in negotiations with very fierce men?
What helps me? What's meant
Being a woman.
Well,
Forgive it.
The women in the audience know the answer.
2020. I know it's 2024, but
the best teams on negotiation are men and women together, because we live different lives. Women deal with aggression differently because we're either the recipients of it or because we've learnt how to manage it. We deal with being quieter, we deal with diffusing situations differently. I'm stereotyping like crazy, I know. And men deal with issues in a stronger, sometimes more direct way that is equally valid and important. So when a team works, for me, it's men and women together. Because, sorry, this air's got me again. I'm trying to get out of its line of fire. So I'll come over here now. So, so when you are able to work together, happens to me in America as well, actually. They've always got air conditioning blowing out. When you can get the women and men working together, you get the best of both. And that, I think, is the best possible way that you can try and get an agreement.
Got a few questions about Putin now. And whether Chris Nibbs, will Putin take advantage of the sidelining of the Ukraine war by events in the Middle East? And in contrast, that Don Muir was inspired by your joke that you told Lavrov, and he wonders whether you ever had a joke to break the ice with Vladimir Putin.
Oh, God, no. I met Putin, I don't know, 20 plus times. He's, I think, in my view, driven by two things. One is history of his country. This is not Soviet Union, this is Mother Russia. And the other is legacy. And part of his driving force at the moment is he does not want to be the Russian president who lost Ukraine. The truth is he's already lost it, because whatever happens, he can never take that country. He can never take that people. He can physically walk into parts of it, but he can't hold it, because as a country, they will never, ever be Russian. And that's what's so extraordinary. A lesson he has not learned from history is that history is littered with examples where people move and take a country, but they can't hold on to it. And he can't hold Ukraine. He can make it, distort it, try and change parts of it, but it's not his. And I think what we've seen in the 20 years of his engagement is a fundamental part of him, which is that he has no interest, and this was obvious when I met him, no interest in being part of something with you. You know, when you were talking, and I was talking to him about, when I very first met him as Trade Commissioner, about economic issues, I negotiated the final bit of Russia's engagement with the World Trade Organization. The Americans and I negotiated that with Russians in St. Petersburg. But he's never been interested in being part of something European or part of something with us. He's only ever been interested in what you can do for him, what talking to you will give him. So you're useful as long as he can see a clear outcome for himself, or as he defines it, his version of Russia. And that means that you're never into long-term work together. You're only ever into transactional opportunities. And once you know that about him, then everything that will follow becomes clearer. That he's interested in talking, should he ever get to the point, should Ukraine want to talk to him, it's their choice, about the end of the war, he'll only be interested in what's in it for him. He's not interested in what it might mean for the broader security of Europe.
I'm going to finish in two areas. Briefly, if we could on Iran. Gurdeep Singh, he says the deal you described took a long time to finalize, and now it's gone thanks to Trump, he says. Was this, with hindsight, was this a mistake? Future looks bleak. Where do you think it will end up?
Oh, simple question to end with. Thanks very much. It was a very bad day when Donald Trump decided to rip up the deal. And I did spend a lot of time trying to persuade people around him and lots of people in Congress that it was a bad idea to do that. And I was right, because it's been a very bad idea. We now have a situation where Iran is much closer to a nuclear weapon than they've ever been, and where there is no natural dialogue going on, either between Iran and the West or between the permanent members of the Security Council. So we've lost not just the capacity to negotiate with Iran, but also to have the conversation between Russia, China, US, and so on. It's not hopeless. The good news, in a way, is that the new government in Iran is partly made up of the people we negotiated the original deal with. So the foreign minister of Iran is a man called Abbas Araghchi, who was the deputy chief negotiator. And so he knows very well all of the intricacies of that agreement. And there is hope, small hope, that maybe there are some things that can be put back. Can't put the big deal back, but maybe we can do some small things that will actually make the situation a bit better. It's a bit difficult because it's in the context of this much bigger issue of what happens now in the Middle East and what Israel is going to do or not do to retaliate against Iran. We'll see the outcome of that fairly soon. But we have to keep, diplomacy is about drip, drip. I think I've already said that. We need to keep dripping and trying to find small things that we can do to make this situation not get worse.
I've got a fistful of questions about Israel to finish. I wonder if I could just give you the flavour of them, and then you could give us your thoughts.
I can imagine.
So Helen Hatcher, if you were still in office, what would you do about Israel and the current Middle East conflict? Claire, what advice would you give to Benjamin Netanyahu? Joe Sexton, can you sort out the Israel-Palestine situation, please? And unnamed, and what next in Israel-Palestine? And Jeff Elliott, what would starting small look like in the Palestine-Israel conflict?
I spent more time in the Middle East on the Israeli-Palestinian issue than on anything else, even though I don't write about it in the book. And the reason I don't write about it is because I wanted to tell stories that had at least an arc to them. And wherever you began on the Middle East, there's no arc. You just end up or begin somewhere where somebody says, aha, so you're either in the Israeli camp or the Palestinian camp. I am in neither, and I am in both. I worked with Secretary John Kerry particularly to try and support all of the efforts that were being done to try and do the only solution that will work, which is to get to a two-state solution. And of course, for what's happened in Israel and the horrors of October the 7th last year, and then what's happened in terms of the loss of life in Gaza, what's happened with Hezbollah attacking Israel, and now Israel in Lebanon, with all of the potential impact that has, not least through Iran and its proxies, to turn this into a megastorm that will, at the end of it, leave many, many more innocent people dead. All of that is where we currently are and the situation that we face. There is only one solution to the problem at the core of this. And if I were in office, that would be the number one thing I would be saying, the number two thing I would be saying, and most importantly, the thing I would be asking the international community to come together to try and deliver. A couple of things that are really important about diplomacy and foreign policy, which is we don't think long-term enough. These problems take decades, if not centuries. Remember the Serbs and Kosovars, 1389. It's not unusual to hear of problems that have taken 100 years, 200 years, before they've erupted again. You can't solve that in 5 years. You can't solve that probably in 10 years. And I do not believe you can reach a safe two-state solution in the Middle East in probably less than 30 or 40 years, where people feel safe. So the question is, are we going to start the journey now and get there? Not in my lifetime, maybe not in most of yours, but in some people's lifetimes, and with a very definite solution. And I liken it a bit to, when people built the pyramids or the great cathedrals of Britain, They knew they weren't going to see the end product, but they still built it. They still put the first stone on the floor. They still started, and they had a vision of what it could be. And I think what's wrong with our thinking about, especially the Middle East, is that we don't have the vision thing. We don't actually say, these are traumatized people in desperate circumstances. Why do we expect them to even contemplate being able to live anywhere near each other? Of course not. Now, that's our job. Our job is to be the people that, in a sense, look longer and further and think seriously, how would we plan this if we could? How are we going to, in 50 years' time, know that what we have built is something that is peaceful and safe and secure? Sounds like a pipe dream. Sounds like, oh, well, she can say all that. But there is no other option that anybody has ever given me or I've ever heard, either in Israel or in Gaza or on the West Bank or in any other part of the region, never mind in any other part of Europe or in America. And I've certainly asked 1,000 times, well, if we don't do that, what should we do? And there isn't any other answer. So we might as well get on with it. And that's what I think what I would be doing if I was in office. My frustration is we have known this for decades. I have sat with people who have been trying to negotiate this for a long time. We all feel complete failures because we have not done it. And I really hope the next generation coming through of negotiators now will actually be able to succeed where we didn't.
I'm going to finish with words from the foreign correspondent of The Guardian, Luke Harding. The assumption was that she would be hopeless. In fact, she proved to be the consummate diplomat, quietly effective, focused on detail, and often the only woman in the group picture. We saw that. She was interested in getting things done rather than grandstanding, and painfully aware that there were no perfect solutions to complex issues. No other British person will lead European foreign policy. She is, alas, the first and the last. You met her tonight. Thank you, Cathy Ashton. Well done.